Welcome to the next Mad TV series, All Things Tenere 700. Imagine if you put in one room a bunch of people who love and live motorcycle adventure. Experts in their respective fields of engineering, mechanics, suspension and accessory development, who all love the Yamaha Tenere 700 and recognise its potential to be the iconic adventure bike for the 2020s. In this series, I have the great privilege of learning from this vast pool of knowledge and then applying what I've learnt to make my Tenere 700 the best it can be for me. Welcome to the All Things Tenere episode on suspension. The riding conditions that you experience are extremely varied. For some, depending on access to trails, your bike will barely be ridden on a gravel road. And for others, they will be riding on thousands of kilometres of dirt trails and take their bike's suspension to its engineered limits. It doesn't matter where you sit in the range of use of your bike, I'm confident that you'll take something away from this episode that you can apply. For the past couple of months, I've been talking to a number of suspension specialists about bike setup for the Tenere 700, and it's time to tease out the key messages from those discussions. To assist me on my journey of discovery, I've caught up with a group of suspension specialists I've known for a couple of years. There's Nick Dole of Technic Motorsport, located in Penrith, Sydney, Gary Ben, a technical supervisor for CDR Yamaha Monster Energy motocross team from Melbourne, Clive Ward of Motorcycle Biz Raymond Terrace, northwest of Newcastle, and John Mitchinson of Rally Road Products in the UK. In this episode, these guys will share a truckload of knowledge and experience on suspension that will hopefully make this voodoo science a little clearer. There's also a great interview with Grant Denyer, a television personality in Australia, where he discusses suspension modifications for the Tenere 700 for those that are significantly vertically challenged. Grant is 5 foot 5 inches in the old money, so he has definite expertise in this area.
What's the go?
For the past couple of months, I've had the privilege of riding a number of Tenere 700 suspension setups, from stock with adjustments through to a $2,000 Andriani system, and everything in between. And during this episode, I'll give my thoughts on those setups along the way. I was very fortunate to be one of the first in Australia to ride the Yamaha T700 in a 300 kilometre test loop of freeway, blacktop, twin and single trail. On that day, the bike that I rode had already been modified with a heavier rear spring and some fork work, but the suspension setup was still in development. I couldn't fault the bike's suspension on the freeway, blacktop or reasonably smooth twin trail. It was only after pushing the bike at speed on rougher trails that I felt that it could do with some suspension work. The bike that I was riding on this day had already been fitted with a heavier 90 Nm spring, but on the hard fast terrain, hitting G-outs and potholes at speed, it was clear that improvements could still be made to compression and rebound dampening characteristics of both the front and rear suspension. But let's hold on a minute. The simple solution when you reach rough terrain is just to slow down. After all, as one Yamaha executive said to me, it's not a motocross bike, it's a big dual sporter. A couple of weeks later, I rode a standard T700 at the Yamaha dealer's presentation at Port Macquarie and spent some time following and filming Greg Yager. We were riding those trails at a reasonably quick pace, and it was obvious the rear suspension on my bike was undersprung for those conditions. The forks held up reasonably well at this pace, but the bike was wallowing in some of the larger bumps. But later on in the day, I rode with other riders at a slower pace, and the suspension performed well. My view that the standard suspension was pretty good on the T700 was reinforced a couple of weeks later when I rode the Tenere Tragics, a navigational ride of 2,500 kilometres of smooth dirt tracks, a bit of sand and tarred back roads. The bike I rode for this event was the same one I rode at Port Macquarie a couple of weeks before. The bike had a light load of camera gear and a basic tool set. The preload on the rear suspension was wound up to the maximum. I'd have to say I had no complaints. We were punching out over 400 kilometres per day, and what I liked about the standard suspension was the first 30mm of travel that was soft and plush and made long days in the saddle easy. What's going on, Clive? What are we doing today?
We're fixing the suspension today.
My first port of call on my journey to understand the secrets of the T700 suspension is to catch up with Clive Ward, aka the Professor. Started working on it to get it the way you want it, so what have you done so far?
Pulled the shock out and measured it. Decided that dampening was too soft, rebound was pretty close, so I changed the valving and then put a heavier spring in it. So, I know the spring was not up to standard. I did all the sag measurements.
Yeah.
So I've gone from a standard one, 6.6 or 6.7, I think I measured it at.
Yeah.
And I've put a 9 kilo in it.
Yep.
And then the front, we can't buy springs for them at the moment, so I just put a 5mm spacer in to get the preloaded a bit better and get the sag correct, and then I redamped the forks as well. But when we did the sag measurements, it was sagging way too far, with both just under its own static sag and then under rider sag as well, and that was without any gear or anything, and I usually carry gear, so...
What's going on here? He's taken off on your bike.
He loves them all.
Clive's bike has already been modified, and Clubby takes it for a spin to see how the suspension feels. My old mate Clubby wants the Professor to do his magic and make the suspension on his bike more dirt oriented. Now, I want you to look closely at this exchange between the bike rider chasing the perfect setup and the suspension specialist. And you may recall I was just talking about the value of having that first 30mm soft and plush to reduce rider fatigue on the long miles.
It doesn't just go all the way through on the front end especially, eh? Yeah. The only thing I'd love is a little more give just for the back on the road, like just, that's all. But as soon as you get on the dirt, and I went up to Croft Road, and along there, and just in the gutters on both sides, and some good holes. It's just so much better in that sort of off-road stuff, isn't it? Because it's sitting up higher, and it feels like you've still got all the travel to use once you start hitting that sort of off-road stuff, mate.
Yes.
Definitely.
So the give in the fork or the shock or both?
No, the shock more.
The shock
when
more?
I say I want a little... Oh, no, probably both. But I'm talking about when you've got your last 100 k's to get home on the tar, and you just want a really soft, easy lounge chair ride, if that makes any sense. But, I mean, that's a hard ask.
The Professor's grown, and these facial expressions tell it all. Clubby is saying, "Come on, Professor, give me more. I want dirt handling and that soft plush feel on the road." And the Professor is saying, "Mate, you can't have it all." And then he utters that magic word that underpins the quest for perfect suspension on an adventure bike: compromise.
To be as good on the dirt as it is,
yes,
and then to be as compliant in the very first couple of inches is what I'm saying
well,
about
it's on the compromise.
Yeah, it's a compromise for sure, but I think the compromise of being
So while Clubby continues to negotiate with the Professor, I thought I'd get Gary Ben to talk about the importance of static sag and rider sag, which are controlled by the appropriate springs in the front and rear of the bike. But as Gary points out, due to fuel loads and water and gear, the weight of an adventure bike changes significantly during a ride.
Hi, my name's Gary Ben. I work for CDR Monster Yamaha. My role there is pretty much the technical side of things over the years, more the suspension lately. So I just want to talk a little bit today about the new Tenere and what you should and shouldn't do about your suspension. First of all, I'd like to really stress that don't get too caught up on figures. People seem to quote figures of what your ride sag should be, what your ride height. Because you've got to remember, you're starting with a fuel tank of 16 litres, which is 16 kilos, probably a 3 litre backpack with water in it, which you hydrate yourself during the day, so you're losing up to 20 kilos of weight from the morning to the afternoon. So it's all a compromise. So you've got to think about that when you, and then obviously you add more stuff, but it's important to get it the spring rates correct for you get a good ride. You've got to make a compromise and get your weights fairly well correct for the average of what the bike's going to be. Not perfect at the start of the day, probably not perfect at the end, but an average. Right, so the importance of spring rate is pretty much for your own safety, for comfort, and for the working of the motorcycle. If you have too soft a spring, the bike will be way too low in its stroke, which means you get into the hard part of the stroke of the links. So on small skatey stuff, you've passed that. It's too heavy. So it's important that you get the bike up in the right position, which we think is about 70 mil of rider sag as a ballpark figure.
So this is the thing, Gary. My understanding is, and a few of the suspension specialists are all saying the same thing. If the suspension is sag, that's a suspension you're not using.
You're
it's
not
dead.
using, but also the link is progressive. So the start of the stroke, the start of the wheel stroke or the start of the shock stroke is soft, and as it goes through the stroke, it gets progressively harder to stop it bottoming out. So if you're past the first part of the stroke, you've lost a lot of your soft plush, which will give you traction.
Yeah, so that's your what I call trail feel. Is that what is that the bit?
Yeah, you could call it trail feel. Yeah, so it's important that you get it to sit up to get that plush drive, and you'll notice it out of corners on corrugations, for example. If you're past that soft part, that drive will be skittery and hard. So you'll notice it with that, and it'll give you a harsh ride, but not good traction either.
So the secret to this is to try to get some trail feel in that first 30 mils of the suspension, and then to progressively take up those harder hits.
Correct, which you probably have to do with valving, so your suspension person will be able to do that, so that if you do hit those big washaways, or it's usually the ones you don't see, is going to catch you out. You know, you can adjust your riding style, your technique to the ones you do see, but the ones you don't see is what can catch you out if your suspension's not correct.
It'd be fair to say that the first step in getting a suspension right is firstly understanding what you're going to do with the bike, but getting that static sag and rider sag correct for your weight. Even if you went out and just bought the springs at first and just did that fundamental step, would you agree that that's if you didn't want to spend any more money, if you just went out and just bought the springs for your weight, that you'd be miles in front?
Yeah, the biggest improvement you can make to the bike is get the sag right, because it's so undersprung. It does make a massive difference, and there's no point in playing around with the clickers on your compression and rebound damping until you get the sag right. The sag is the baseline for the whole bike setup. So, like I say, the first thing to do, get the static sag right, then check your rider sag, because every rider's a different weight. Some people just permanently travel solo, some travel solo with luggage, some travel two up with a pillion. So you really want to find the right spring that suits your style of riding and the conditions you use. And then once you've got that right, then you can start looking at damping adjustment, because the thing is, you want to be in the top of the stroke. And you, like you said, you've noticed that now.
Yes.
That the bike sits up now. And the whole point of especially with the Yamaha, it's got a rising rate linkage on the rear end. So the whole point of a rising rate rear linkage is, as it goes through the stroke, it changes the leverage. And so you don't want to be already halfway through the stroke before you even hit anything. The idea is you want to be up in the top of the stroke, so you've got the suppleness, the initial suppleness to cope with small tree roots and small bumps.
Yeah, one of the people who we've spoken to is Gary Ben, who's an expert on suspension. And he was saying this very point, John, about the progressiveness. And if you get to the bottom of the stroke, or you know, you're coming to that bit where there's more progressive resistance than there ever has been. And so you're just wasting a whole lot of suspension that you've got from the top.
Yeah, that's I've been riding our bike over the winter, over sort of fairly close to us on a sand track, and there's been we bumped into other guys with Teneres, the new T700s, and they've ridden our bike, and that's the first thing they said is, it's taller than the standard bike, have you got taller suspension? And we said, no, this is the stock shock, stock forks, but with the springs correct for the weight of the bike and for the rider. And the first thing they noticed that they were a little bit tippy toe, but they said how much better the bike tracks in the sandy ruts and everything. So it is a thing that you've got to get that sag right first before you start playing around with clickers and oil and shims or whatever. Just get the sag right, and then for a lot of people that's going to more than be enough for them.
Back to the professor's laboratory, where we focus on my bike with standard suspension and spend some more time talking about static sag and rider sag.
If you look at that, that's the static sag there now, with 20 kilos on it.
Yeah.
And that's the preload wound all the way up. Once you sit on that, you're probably using 45, 50 mil already. You'll sit on it, you'll push it through another 60. It'll be 120 mil through the sag.
Yes.
It's only got 218 mil of travel, so you're more than 50% of your way through the sag.
Before you start riding the thing.
So when you hit a bump, instead of having this much speed for the shock to absorb it, you've got this much space to the shock to try and absorb it. So the springs are vital. Get it up where it's supposed to sit. Get the sags correct. Gives the shock more chance to absorb bumps, but we'll also revalve it and make sure that the valving is at the right rate to absorb them better as well.
So what are you doing, Court?
I'm going to put a cable tie on here, which we'll use as a measurement device. Crude but effective. So I'm just going to stand the bike up under its own weight. When I push it right up so the wheel unweights, you can see that static sag is nearly 50 mil.
Wow.
And it should be about 20.
Right.
So the reason for that is not that the spring is underrated on these, they're a 0.57, but the spring is under preloaded. So we'll put a 5 mil preload spacer on top of the spring, and that will get the sag much closer to where it needs to be. This spring should do anyone up to around about 85, 88 kilos. We'll have to go to bigger springs for heavier riders, but we've still got to make sure the spring's preloaded correctly. See how far that is?
Look at that. So that's all that.
Yes.
It is 50 mil, so 2 inches of the travel.
Yeah, he's used up just in sag.
Yeah.
It's mad, isn't it? Yeah.
Mad.
Well, it is.
It's mad. It's mad TV.
It's not only mad TV, it's mad suspension, isn't it? But that says it all, mate, isn't it?
Yeah.
Look at this one now.
Oh, hang on,
It'll be 3/5 to 5/8.
Hang on.
So this is one we prepared earlier.
It's like a Colgate
Oh,
ad.
look, yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I see. Look.
About 28 mil on that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unbelievable.
Yeah, so basically you've used up all your suspension before you've even got out the door.
Before you've even hit a bump, yeah.
Yeah.
You're leaving it nothing to actually, no time to deal with the bumps it's hitting.
Clubby, it's Clive's worked his magic.
Oh, mate, it's
You're back.
you got to start with spring rates, but like look, you know.
What you're saying, you're svelte.
Well, there was a time when it was svelte, yes, but that was some time ago.
There's a couple of hamburgers hidden
Oh,
under
there's
there now.
been a few snot blocks and custard tarts on Tenere tragic rides since then. But it's all about springing the bike to your weight, and then this. Now this has got all my tools, tubes and spares. Like I could survive on this for about 3 or 4 days away.
Give me a feel. Give me a feel.
But no, we're going to weigh it. We're going to weigh it. So, what do you reckon? There's 10 kilos there.
I reckon that's
13,
13 kilos.
Let's go and see what it officially weighs.
Because this is important stuff.
This is what I'd take it weigh.
Because if we don't weigh the stuff, we don't know.
Official digital decimal scale.
It's coming in 13 kilos.
9.6. I said 10, didn't I? 9.7 kilos. Yeah.
9.6.
Yeah, and that would be all my tools and tubes, and 1 pair of shorts, 2 t-shirts, undies, toiletries, and a pair of slap-on shoes.
How many snot blocks?
No snot blocks. Snot blocks are here.
Hey, where are you storing them?
Right there, mate.
Okay.
Never leave home without them, Dave.
Get on there and tell us what it is.
This will be bloody.
Yeah, well, this is good because...
Oh, 105.
Yeah, but that's...
Oh,
medicine.
beauty. Geared up, thank you. 10
Yeah,
kilos
geared
of gear, easy.
Yeah.
Easy. But that's what. But the bike is sprung for what? 75 kilograms.
So I weigh 92 kilos. So, you know, when we're talking about weight and that, I was thinking to myself, I keep thinking I'm 92 kilos, but I'm never geared up. So let's have a go. This is my normal gear. Got a couple of cameras, got my Klimp suit on, helmet. What do you reckon I'm going to be, 92?
92
It's
plus
my normal
riding gear. You're going to be 105,
108.
I reckon, give him a benefit.
108.
Oh, Professor.
Professor's got it.
There you go, 108 kilos.
I'm out by 0.1.
108.
And then add your luggage, your
The
tools
luggage. Hang on, keep
onto
that
the
up,
bike
hang on.
as well. Yeah.
So let's have a look at the bike over there. That's got a 10 kilos on the back. And then you got a 2 kilo. So we're looking at 120 kilos on the bike. And I'm not a huge bloke.
Now take into account, those racks are not free weight,
No.
the crash bars are not free weight, and the bigger, heavier bash plate is not free weight. So that's all extra weight added to the bike's original spec weight.
So
Yeah.
it must be, so I'm carrying probably 126 kilos. Something like that. Yeah, it's a huge difference, isn't
Oh,
it?
you need to be sprung for that. That's what we're saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, they're sprung for it.
I've learnt something today. Well, I've learnt a lot today, but that's a big thing. I'm a heavy bastard when I'm loaded with my gear.
Heavier.
That's not including
Heavier
this
bastard.
camera that you would normally
Yeah.
carry as well,
Yeah,
that
yeah.
Connie's hanging on to.
But you haven't got any clothes on there. You haven't got tools on there.
So the wash up from the rider sag measurements is that while I weigh 92 kilograms, when you add my riding gear, backpack and camera gear for a day ride, I weigh about 118 kilograms. And then if I was to go on a tour, there would be an additional 15 kilograms of camping gear that would take my total rider sag weight to close to a whopping 135 kilograms. Now, being aware of that total weight, there is no way I would head out on a tour with the standard springs. But that said, when I bumped into Nick Sanders on his 8th round the world tour on his T700 in Sydney, he told me the suspension for his round the world bike was a standard setup. Mind you, he weighs 73 kilograms and he packs real light for touring.
Well, I'm a slight guy really in some ways, about 73 or 4 kilos. So, and I think my total weight of everything here is, no more than 10 or 15 kilos, to be perfectly honest. So there you go, that gives you an idea. I'm using normal production suspension. We haven't needed to alter it in any way. And if you're a heavier guy, then maybe you might want to look into it. But no, up to about 80, 90 kilos. Factory settings are fine for me.
Anyway, more important, what's happening back inside the shed with the Professor? Right, now what's going on here, Professor?
So we've taken the springs out of the forks, we've taken the air bleeders out, and now we're going to measure just the damping that's going on inside there, so the hydraulic part of it. We've got a motor down on the bottom here that's going to simulate motion and speed, and we've got a sensor here that's going to measure the load forces, and then the computer's going to calculate it all for us and draw us lots of squiggly lines. And from that I'll be able to judge what's going on. I could teach you how to read that, but then I'll have to kill you.
I'll get the abridged version in the client's report afterwards, mate.
The T700 comes with fully adjustable suspension with compression and rebound dampening. But the Professor believes he can improve off-road performance of the suspension by going beyond those adjustments and changing the internal valving of the forks and rear shock. These changes alter the rate of flow of oil, either increasing or reducing that flow, depending on the characteristics that are sought after.
So everything above that centre line is compression dampening, everything below is rebound dampening. What we're seeing here is very, very flat compression dampening.
But the clickers must have been. 2
clicks out. I'd wound it all the way in because I kept
Yeah,
one in,
okay,
one in,
so
one
this
in
obviously
to
must
see
not
what
be-
it, see
how far,
how stiff I
yeah.
could get it, and I
Yep.
decided it all the way in. It still wasn't stiff enough.
The rear shock is removed, tested and then disassembled, and some new valving is installed. The Professor then shows us the changes he has made in the rear shock characteristics. But at the end of the day, these are just graphs that inform suspension specialists of the changes they are making. The real test occurs out on the tracks. Now, Clubby has asked for improved dirt handling for his bike. Let's go for a ride and see if the Professor has worked his magic. The great thing about today is that my bike has stock suspension that will assist me in immediately comparing the bikes on the same terrain.
TV, or take mine, just go back out to the fucking road where we just came in from.
Yeah.
Just compare it, like it is fucking night and day, mate. Better.
Yeah.
Like just straight away, while that is fresh on your mind from just
Yeah.
getting pounded in there, and just feel the difference, mate.
I jump on Clubby's bike with the new suspension modifications that include a heavier rear spring and a change in the valving of the rear shock to improve compression damping. The front fork had a 5mm nylon spacer for preload, and the high-speed compression stack has been modified for more compression damping.
Comparison between my standard bike suspension and this one. It's just so good. Guys, let me give you a cuddle. Mate, the difference between this bike and my bike, you know, mine's got the standard suspension at the moment, nothing done, and this bike, I've just blasted down here with Clubby after doing it on my black bike. Mate, you've done such a good job.
Hit the nail?
He hit it on the head. And the confidence, it's just confidence inspiring, isn't it? Like you get into that stuff like that first little, or this little gnarly bit coming up here with the rocks and that, going a bit faster, and it just tracks well. It's bloody brilliant.
I bet the first two you hit, you were cringing on, wondering
I
how
was.
hard it was going to
I was,
hit.
I went, oh,
and
it was
then you
good.
realised it didn't hit at all, and you could just keep going and picking up more and more speed.
Yep. My only fear now is that I've got to recalibrate when I get back on my bike, just to bring back the speed a bit, because yeah, you just can't hit things at the same speed. But gee, you've just got that together, and you know, getting a hug from me, that's the first time on Mad TV anyone's been hugged. So that's 10 years on Mad TV and no hugs. So mate, you must have done all right. No, bloody brilliant, Clive. Excellent. That's what
On the way home, I reflected on Clubby's new suspension and the improvements in bike handling in the dirt. At home, waiting for me, was a box of goodies from John Mitchinson, who has been a long-time supporter ever since my ride from London to Sydney. After hearing from John as to what he had sent me, my next step was to head out to suspension specialist Nick Dole of Technic Suspension to have these parts fitted and learn some more about this dark art. Tell me what you've sent me and where we hope that will be.
The two things we sent you were the stiffer rear shock spring and an upgraded fork kit for the standard open cartridge of the bike. And they're really the first things we addressed on the bike, because we've had the bike now for nearly a year in the UK, and I've been using ours mainly for off-road. But one of the first things we found was the sag of the bike was way too much on the rear. So to address that, we went for stiffer rear springs, because the bike's set up for about 60-65 kilo rider, which is way under most European and American, Australian riders, plus that doesn't even allow for any luggage. So that was a fairly straightforward fix. We've had some special springs wound right up to 95 Newton millimetre. And then once we sorted the sag on the rear end, that was getting the static sag right and the rider sag with various luggage loads. That did tend to make the forks work a little bit better, because it transferred more weight to the forks. But the forks were still very sharp, especially under heavy braking. We found you couldn't, and even off-road riding, you were struggling to get anywhere near the 200 millimetre travel that they state on the fork. So that was one of the things that we really got into, was the reason why, and that took about 6 months really.
It was only in recent times that I would even consider turning to a suspension specialist. Frankly, I thought it was all crap. And that was until a few years ago when I rode a standard Yamaha WR250R back-to-back with one set up by Nick Dole of Technic Suspension. The difference was amazing, and so too was the riding pleasure. As a result of Nick's work, the Yamaha WR250R has gotten a cult following in Australia as a respected, tough little adventure bike. Great to see you again, mate.
Yeah, Dave.
Good to see you. We'll wave.
See you. That was
COVID's
close.
here.
That was close. Today we're going to do three things. we're going to get the standard rear shock, pull the 69 Newton spring off it, put the 80 on it, and put the Rally Raid kit into the front fork and change the fork springs. One of the aspects of this bike that people are struggling with is what is it actually for? It's very difficult to have a bike that can do everything because you then have an expectation that it will do everything. It can be like a WR450 on steroids. You expect to be able to do 500 k's a day on the tar for consecutive days and have no back pain, no foot pain, no hand pain, nothing. It's supposed to be beautiful at doing that. It's supposed to be beautiful and compliant when it's fully loaded up with gear or it's empty. And then you treat it like a WR450 again. And that's one of the areas where I think everyone is struggling to say, well, how do I set this thing up so my customer can achieve all of those things successfully?
One of the strengths of this bike, Nick, is that it handles dirt so well.
Sure.
And it wants you to push it harder.
Yeah.
And it actually, I think that's where the confusion is.
It goads you.
It does. It does goad you. There's no doubt about it, because it's such a good handling dirt bike, and yet it does the road well as well. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and it feels light and nimble, and I've had plenty of people say it feels like a WR450 on steroids.
Yes.
Then the challenge of not making it into something too specific.
Yes.
Because it's relatively easy to make it into a 700cc WR.
Yes.
That's easy to do.
Yes.
And with a couple of customers' bikes, that is exactly what we've done. They think it's great.
Yes.
Because they can jump it off anything, spoon drains, I can clear doubles on it, it's no problem at all. But then when they bang out thousands of Ks on the tar,
it knocks them about.
It's uncomfortable.
Yes. Yeah.
So how do you balance it?
Yeah. The task for Nick today is to fit the Rally Raid product's suspension components sent by John Mitchinson. Nick has already completed his own extensive development work on the T700 suspension, but both he and I agree it's a great opportunity to experience firsthand what John Mitchinson has developed in the UK. It's also a great opportunity to compare the results. So what has John given me? The rear suspension is simple. The shock remains untouched, and all that is fitted is a heavier 80 Nm spring for my weight. The front fork kit includes heavier springs, fork caps with adjustable preload, SKS fork seals, and a less aggressive hydraulic cone valve. The shim stack is left as standard. Finally, the standard 2.5 weight fork oil is replaced with 10 weight.
So you can see here, that's the standard hydraulic cone. That's his. He's obviously gone for a far less aggressive cone.
Right.
Right. So as the fork compresses, that cone then moves in and creates a hydraulic lock. So John's piston has been machined back, so it won't be as aggressive when it gets into the cone. Right,
So what does that mean in terms of ride?
So all this is for is when you come close to bottoming the fork out. This is the thing that if you reach the end of the travel, it stops you from feeling the fork chrome tubes smashing into the cap, right? Which doesn't feel particularly good because you really feel it. It's really unpleasant.
So why would John Mitchinson from Rally Raid pick SKF fork seals?
Because they're currently regarded as being the lowest drag seal.
Okay, so they're slipperier.
Yeah, it is technically both sliding friction and breakaway especially.
Right.
So it's the force that it takes to get the fork seal to initially move. All right, so one of the really cool parts for me of this kit is the thing that the bike really lacks, and that is a preload adjuster on the fork. I think they didn't put an OEM preload adjuster on it purely for cost. There's no reason why an adventure bike should not have a preload adjustable cap.
So after Nick fitted my suspension modifications, I asked him if there were any rules that could be applied to static sag and rider sag. As expected, the answer wasn't clear, but nevertheless useful. And certainly useful to all riders to have a look at to gain an appreciation if their bike is under or over sprung.
The static sag should be 10% of your total travel, and the rider sag should be 30%. These are not absolutes. This is simply a place to start when you don't have anywhere else. But they are numbers that have now been around for a long time, and whilst you may not end up at, say, 10%, you might end up at 8% or 12%. You won't be far off. So it's, and 30% is the same. You might end up at 28%, you might end up at 32%. But you're just getting a place to begin.
Nick then spent some time working on the clickers on my bike, which is the finer adjustment. What both Nick and Clive have discovered is the compression damper clickers on the rear shock and front forks are not that responsive, but rebound clickers are good.
We know from both the on-bike testing we've done and the dyno testing especially, that changes to the compression adjuster are not particularly effective. It only really makes a difference when the adjuster is near fully closed. Rebound adjuster though is quite good. One click out that side. So
Compression at the top or rebound at the top?
rebound at the top.
Rebound at the top.
So
7 for rebound.
7 out full hard.
Yeah,
Comp adjusters are at 1.
at 1.
So they're completely closed.
Mm-hmm.
So you pretty much can't generate any more
Resistance
damping in the fork. So how did you find the fork at 1?
I quite like it.
Oh.
I like it. So, and then when I was going through some really extreme undulation, short stuff, it actually worked quite well.
Yep,
I don't have much complaints about the forks.
yep, yep.
No, yeah, it's the rear end is coming through. I'm just bottoming out.
Mm-hmm.
It's controlled bottoming, but it just doesn't seem to have enough slowing,
Yep,
and it just seems to be a little bit outweighted.
yep, sure. So here you can see you're putting it through a series of whoops, and you are lacking damping in both directions. It's not just a lack in compression, but rebound as well. Whereas the fork actually doesn't look that bad.
Does it? No.
Bear in mind, in these shots, the compression adjuster is on full hard. But the rear, yeah, it's a bit uncontrolled. But if you had have tried some of it's fairly uncontrolled actually. But if you had have tried some of the adjustments, then I'm not saying you would have made it perfect, but you probably could have made it a bit more bearable.
Yeah. I guess this tells me two things, is the standard shock with the right spring,
Yep.
the standard shock with the right adjustment, plus a spring for my weight will be the best solution for me.
I'm not convinced that the standard rebound damping will be sufficient for an 80 Newton spring. I think you will end up with the adjuster on full hard or near full hard most of the time.
Yep.
However, it's worth a test.
Yep. Well, we'll do it.
As we all know, it's a bit difficult to get out and about at the moment with that bloody virus floating around. So at this stage I haven't been able to hit the road on my bike with its new suspension modifications. So we're going to finish up there with a promise when we return. Not only will we dirt test my new suspension setup, but we'll also do a back-to-back comparison with clubbies that Clive Ward set up earlier in the program. I'm feeling a bit guilty that we didn't bring this suspension journey to a conclusion, so I'm throwing in a couple of extras. Firstly, an interview with Grant Denyer, an adventure bike enthusiast who is on the short side. He talks about the very useful modifications that can be made to the T700 suspension for shorter riders. And secondly, come with me on a ride of a T700 with a top-of-the-line suspension setup. A lot of adventure riders, they go, oh, you know, the bike's too tall, and they don't realise that there's a tremendous amount of modification you can do to bring these back.
A lot of women riders too also a bit daunted by the prospect of it, and I know that I was, and I'm currently on a WR 250, which is it's lower in height, so I was scared about getting on this because if my legs can't touch, it kind of gets into my brain, and then I get scared, and then I don't ride as well. And if there's an element of fear in your mind that I can't stop at any point, then it's not enjoyable. This, however, is actually really good for short guys. There's a couple of things on there.
Yeah, come on, show us through the mods.
So the seat is a shaved seat, so it's lower than the standard one. We do have a lowering link on this as well, which is not expensive, but just makes it a hell of a lot more comfortable. And if you come around to the front forks, you can see how there's about 40mm poking out the top, so it's been dropped that far. It doesn't change the geometry a hell of a lot. I don't believe it makes it much different to ride.
You don't seem to be slowing down because of it.
No, it hasn't slowed me down. But you know what I'm not afraid of? Traffic lights. So I used to be stressed about stop signs and traffic lights because I don't want to not be able to put a foot down and fall over in front of the traffic. Whereas I haven't even come close to doing anything like that. So I'm 5'5", it's perfect.
Oh, look at this. Steve's Mad TV bike. It's going to give me a ride. Steve, what's the go? It's Steve's Mad TV bike.
Dave, take it for a spin. I know you've been dying to, mate.
Yes.
Go on, jump on.
So just tell me with a suspension setup.
Okay.
Cartridge forks.
Yeah, cartridge forks. It's got the Adriani front forks.
Say it to me again, Sarah.
It's got the Adriani front forks, which have been extended from a standard 180 cartridge to 210.
210?
Because I didn't want to go. You can get it out to 230, but really, I don't want the bike too tall.
Yeah.
It's got the TFX rear shock.
All right.
So it's a full suspension replacement on this bike.
Right.
And you will be able to buy them through Adventure Moto, or you will be able to go straight to Technics and get that sorted. So
I'm looking forward to this.
Now you and I are about the same weight, so see how you think, mate. Jump on.
Yeah. This is.
Need a new sticker for wearing it out.
And it's Greg's one too, right ADV, not the Mad. The Mad TV's fine. Look where that is. That's up there.
Up there.
Oh, look. Here's another thing, viewers. Look at this.
IMS foot pegs. They're a WR 450F foot peg, and they fit perfectly.
That's what you want. That's my first modification.
All right.
Oh God, it feels like a new pair of underwear. Oh, I can feel the difference already from my very standard one. Oh yes. All right. Jesus, you don't have much fuel left, Steve. I won't go fast. Oh, feel these foot pegs. See how you can. Yeah. Oh, that's the best thing you've ever done. I just feel like I'm in satin underwear. Oh my God, the difference is amazing. confidence. The steering geometry of the bike is really good, so the handling, like just the way it handles, is excellent. So try these books now. This will be interesting. I wouldn't have even dared do them in the I'll bring him up.
Dave's already getting them all.
Oh, good.
Yeah, so just pull up a spot somewhere.
I've got to give this back to Steve.
Okay, all right.
There was no doubt the Adriani closed cartridge fork system and the TFS rear shock were excellent during this very short ride. Hard, short, sharp hits were noticeably absorbed far better than the standard system that I was riding. The bike carried whoops well, and at faster speeds those short, sharp pothole edges were soaked up. However, it's worth noting at that stage I'm comparing Steve's bike with mine that still had the standard suspension setup with the softer springs. It's also worth noting the suspension setup on Steve's bike cost 2,000 Australian dollars. And remember, a Tenere 700 in Australia costs around 17,000. I'm really looking forward to back-to-back testing of my suspension improvements with those on Steve's bike and Clubby's new bike setup, which will be a great way to conclude this extended episode. I was going through those whoops and I hear Stephen Goss yell out, "Slow down." So you know.
You like
I've never heard him. Very, very good. Very, very good. No, it's a huge difference. The rear end is perfect. The front end just needs just a little bit of softening in that first 30 mil, I reckon.
I did discuss with Nick about running, you know, progressive front suspension.
Yeah.
He's not a fan of progressive. He thinks that you're better off having a linear spring.
Yeah.
And you just got to get that spring rate right. But we haven't done anything with the spring, so it's a standard front spring. So what we need to do is then look at whether we stiffen it up or even lighten it off.
The back is nailed. It's hard to remember Greg Yager's bike now with the stiffer string and the bit of compression and rebound dampening, but that's another level on Greg's.
Yeah.
That seems
that's a
perfect.
full replacement shock. And the beauty of this is a customer who doesn't want to rip his suspension out and send it to Nick or to us to get it done, we can just package this up and shoot it up and they can change it out.
Yeah, no, it's we might redo that on the Sony later because you know, it's just so good. It's such an improvement. I can see now, like, you're just taking all the shock. See, before, if you look at mine, I've got a little zip tie. I don't take all the shock. You'll see a mark about that, about thick. Yeah.
Anyway.
No, it's really close. It's really good on the hard hitting short stuff.
Yep.
But the softer stuff, you just lose a little bit of trail feel in the front.
Yeah.
Mate, it's brilliant.
We'll get there.
Yeah, development.